Hi everyone. We got some confirmation over text that we are coming through. Hello, to those of you tuning in. Thank you so much for joining us in this virtual space today. My name is Katie Young. I work as an improviser, composer, sound artist, and educator. And along with Anne Clear, I'm one of the composition faculty at this year's Yarn Wire Institute, which is happening in the digital realm. I'm joined today by my collaborator, or I should say co-composer and friend, Linda Jankowska.
Hello, I am tuning in from England, where I'm based. I am primarily a violinist and a new music performer, also an educator and a concert producer, and currently also acting as a composer and sound artist.
Yeah. And since the participants in this summer's institute are working to create new work as socially distanced pairs, one performer paired with one composer, I thought that during this short time I have today, we would focus on questions of collaboration and authorship that Linda and I have consciously foregrounded in our project, Boundary Mind. We are in a cultural moment when many people are reflecting on and taking action to change their own participation in power structures and hierarchies that produce and reproduce inequity, oppression, and can result in violence and death. These hierarchies and power structures can be economic, political, and institutional, but we know they can also be interpersonal. If art can be a space in which we practice and experiment with creating the world we want to live in, then I believe it's important as musicians to consider and reconsider the ways we reinscribe and benefit from established hierarchies in our ways of making music. The specific details of how Linda and I practice co-authorship or co-composition or composite. No, that doesn't work. The way we practice co-authorship in our work together is one very modest example of an attempt to use a creative practice to chip away at power structures and presumed hierarchies that impact how we make music with others. What may at first appear to be simply about the details, the minutiae of Linda's and my creative practice, I think might eventually reveal itself to you to be also about access to resources, economics, and power, which is what we kind of hope to focus on at today. We only have a very short amount of time, and there is obviously a lot to consider and a whole lot of work to be done on many fronts. But we'd like to tell you a little bit about our piece, Boundary Mind, today. So to start, as an introduction to Boundary Mind, I'd just like to play a 30-second teaser trailer that we made with video artist Kera Mackenzie, whose work is linked, I believe, in the YouTube comments or the information on the YouTube page, but she also has a website and you should check out her work. She's a beautiful filmmaker. So that was just a little bit about a little taste of the sound world of Boundary Mind. But this is an installation, performance piece, and that utilizes fixed material. We have recorded a whole whole bunch of sounds, and we're utilizing those in live performance as well as through recordings to create the sound world of Boundary Mind. And Linda, maybe you want to say just a few words about how we came to make Boundary Mind together.
Well, the project started by me writing Katie an email and asking her for a solo piece. And then Katie said no, but I will write you a new piece. And I was traveling with my ensemble, this Stratford, to the States. And I was already across the Atlantic. So I went to visit her in Chicago for the first time. And just to, have a session. And in that session, we discovered that we were just interested in a different way of working. And that's how we embarked on this 7-year-long collaboration.
Yeah, and we should just maybe mention that the piece was meant to be premiered and installed and performed for the first time in this month, actually, originally before the pandemic. It has been postponed to a year from now. And we've been working really closely with presenting organizations Experimental Sound Studio and 6018 North, as well as with video artist Kera Mackenzie and sculptor Molly Roth-Scranton. So it's a big team of people who are working on this piece. But I would like to share a little bit about our plans for the installation, because this piece is about kind of its own process of being made. And Linda and I have spent these years together getting to know each other, and through our art making practice, through sharing stories and sounds, by traveling to each other's places where we grew up, and exploring, sort of doing almost archaeologies of our own childhoods to find objects with sound making potential, and then build the piece out of those sounds and those objects. So you saw some of those objects featured in the short trailer, and we intend to create a multi movement piece that involves installation in a physical space, as well as live performance with those objects, fixed media, video, etc. So just real quickly, I'll show you some pictures of the place we intend to install. We will install the piece at 6018 North, which is kind of a central player, a central character in the work. This is the outside of 6018 North. It's in Chicago. This is a piece that originated kind of with a lot of support from Chicago, and is grounded there. We will, these are some shots of the inside of 6018th North between shows. Many of this artwork will be taken down, but it's a whole house that we have to install sound sculptures and object-based sculptures. It's sort of meant, the piece reflects a sort of interiority and a sort of domestic space at times, and so we think that presenting it in this space is really perfect. There will be, this is a few of the installation elements, but we'll have a playable sculpture, installed room, an archiving lounge, as well as a performance space on the main floor. The performance, or sort of the evening length piece that we'll present, has 4 main components. A piece that's sort of, movement 1 is more of an installation. Movement 2 will be performed live by Linda and me with amplified objects. Movement 3 utilizes some of the sounds and videos that you saw briefly that are then combined, and the video will ultimately be projected onto a sculpture and diffused in the room that way. And then the last movement is acoustic for violin and bassoon. And I would like to play a little bit more of the piece for you now so that you get a sense for that. Just a bit more about how the piece sounds and looks. So here we go. Okay, so that's just a little bit about what the piece is and how it's come together. But mostly, we'd like to try to talk to you a little bit about how we made it. And I think, Linda, I'm going to turn it over to you for a little bit of to kind of give us some framing of the way we've tried to work together. We're kind of like drawing on theoretical frameworks that other people have been working with to kind of reflect on our own process retroactively to some extent.
Can we see the first slide about this? So just to
Sure, sure.
Mhm. Yes, so the first I think that is important is to talk about how performers and composers can embark on this radical collaboration that I think me and Katie have also you know practiced across these years. This is I would like to signpost to a text by Jennifer Torrence, who is a percussionist and new music performer, where she designed this kind of trickle down funnel style model of different types of collaborative practices between. Could you show this grid between the composers and performers, where initially the collaboration starts off with the performer and composers being very far from one another and being, I guess, separated by the score. So score as a medium of conversation, kind of this hypothetical space of conversation between a performer and composer, where the composer has 100% authorship over decision making and over the frame of the piece and everything. So, and then obviously through collaboration, that distance becomes smaller and smaller, and essentially the kind of model that we, through our various practices, discovered is the one of co-creating, co-composing. If we can just see this grid, Katie.
We see it, yeah?
Oh, I cannot see. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Yeah, so I think at the very end, you see that.
Yeah,
All,
I can just jump in because I see the grid. So what I think is also very helpful about Jennifer's taxonomy is the terminology she uses. So she's more specific than just talking about composer and performer, but she comes up with more specific terms for the performer as interpreter and this is the state when the score is primary. Then perhaps the performer eventually becomes and feels more like an advisor when the composition's materials are developed in a workshop setting. The composer keeps autonomy over the majority of artistic choices, using the opportunity as a testing ground for the composer's ideas and or to source ideas from the performer. And this is a situation where authorship starts to become a little bit murkier. Generally, I think the practice would be to still have the composer have the authorship, but I think there's an ethics involved, and one we can talk about and that we should all be thinking about giving acknowledgement and to all of the people who are involved in the process of making the piece. And yes, as Linda mentioned, as the scope narrows, cannot see the slide. Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you. I got a note. Let me try again.
yes. And as sorry, I'm gonna keep talking, but as the scope narrows, also the score becomes less important, and the space of creating and decision making in music becomes shared. So if we can just quickly.
Well, I tried. I'm trying to. It says I'm sharing, so I don't know. Maybe we just keep going. So
I can see it now. I can see the grid.
You can? Okay, great. So yeah, these terms are her, and then she uses the terms. Okay, great. It's here now. A divisor as when the score becomes secondary. So I think it's interesting to just put into very explicit terms like the score can have different functionality, and therefore the people involved can have different roles. And it's not to say that having a score as primary in a traditional division of labor isn't perfectly fine, but it's not the only option, and we have other options and other ways of working if we want them.
I think it also always depends on the kind of questions that people are asking themselves when they are embarking on a shared project. If it's even a shared project from the start, like those are these questions that we need to be asking if we are working with each other and collaborating and creating new work.
Yes, absolutely. So moving on, there's other folks who have talked about this in different ways that are enriching, I think, as well. And Linda, you wanted to talk a bit about this.
Yeah, that's the idea. I mean, I've in some academic texts, I found this term comprovisation, but essentially it is about improvisation between shared improvisation between performers and composers in the process of coming up with sounds that can be this interesting collaborative tool for creating fixed works. And what me and Katie did over the years was meet together in shared space and play with our objects, and in this shared space come up with I don't know, textures and combinations and actually structural decisions. And I think I would like to
she would keep doing the pots and I would start writing a signature.
Yeah.
But we just have tons of these documents in folders that we've shared with each other over the years. This is just as another example. This is the score to this performed the piece for object performers. It's just a narrative text in a Google Doc, and it's pretty detailed. It's very detailed, and I guess we have to memorize this. Have it, but yeah.
But precisely through this process of comprovisation, we essentially became, the bearers of this structural information. Yes, we will have to memorize it, but I think they are quite embodied by, I think, to some extent, and both of us have this profound knowledge about what the piece is because we have made all these decisions together. Obviously, each of us has more memory of some part of it and so on, but I think it is not like, usually sometimes when a composer come up with score, the performer sends lots of email asking, so what do you mean here? What do you mean there? What does this sign mean? And so, how do you want this to sound? So here, I think through this process of comprovisation, we are quite like equally invested in the aesthetic and the shape of the piece. So I think for me very important as a performer was this notion of trans-idiomatic creativity, which I took from one of Anthony Braxton's interviews. Katie, of course, is a friend of Anthony, so she could say much more about his idea of trans-idiomatic practice. But for me, it was just this discovery that we are always more than just one idiom. We are educated in a very particular. Once we step out of this idiom, either as a pianist or composer or something, we discover this creativity that sometimes we didn't even know that we had, and through this process of learning new skills for creation, we become like trans-idiomatic or transdisciplinary, or so it is a beautiful process of just broadening even your perception of self. Then the other question is, the other important thing to mention is that the time investment in collaborative practices, which is definitely much higher from both people. I'm not saying that composition and performance that are like tied to the notion of score are not like heavily time consuming they are, but just the togetherness in these processes is not quite as time yeah, heavy as a collaboration, the kind of collaboration that me and Katie did. So it took us this long because I live in England and Katie lives in the States. So to form this process of togetherness, we had to meet, and that always just prolonged the creation. But because our idea was to create a shared empathy, create shared meaning, it had to take as long as it took, which was 6 years, to arrive at what we have. But actually, that's how we formed a friendship, and that's how we formed this deep understanding of this piece. So collaborative practices are definitely very time consuming, and not always it is possible. And also, I think an important thing to think about is the effort distribution in co-creation, which is that it is a process where boundaries are blurred. So sometimes somebody does more, somebody carries more of the workload, and it just shifts. But it's just is one of these things where you cannot always track like who did or said something that created this area of the piece and so on. So we both do a lot, and I think sometimes each of us has a thing in life that makes them maybe be a bit more distant, but then somebody else takes on the workload, and that's how we distributed the effort of creation.
But there's a lot of trust involved in that distribution, and a lot of renegotiation and checking in and communication that has to be open. I think we have about 5 minutes max. So
okay. Just very quickly, I want to talk about the creative capital sharing, and I would like to signpost to Juliet Fraser's article that I encourage you to read. It's quite interesting the way she talks about what creative capital in the kind of collaborations that we have mean, which is agency, authorship, recognition, and remuneration. And agency, it's quite clear. Agency means creativity and your ideas being respected and so on. I guess authorship is also related to remuneration and recognition, which then comes from various gains, like actually monetizable gains that you can get from the kind of system that we are all in, which is something that it's quite hierarchical still, the system that we operate within. We need to, I think, reconsider and definitely be more open about and talk to one another about, because festivals commission work, new work from composers, grant funding bodies when they award money, they always award money to a single author, so that also doesn't exist.
It's almost impossible to find grants, for example, that Linda and I can apply to together. It's either she applies or I apply, and often we have, in fact, kind of changed. We have adjusted how we describe our role in the project to fit the grant. So sometimes I have to say that I'm the composer of the piece or whatever, so that we can fit into the frameworks of the grant, the granting language.
But I think the more the kind of work is done this way, the more the funding bodies and festival recognize that it is just a thoughtless and maybe not very imaginative way of thinking about authorship that we have to move away from if we want to create more of an equal society and community. And the other thing, obviously, is the job market and the job security, which I think in the pandemic we could observe that so many performers were left insecure, and people for whom there is gainful employment there. So I basically mean, like, I guess professor jobs teaching composition, because it is it's more out there, do not share the same kind of insecurity that is tied to this volatile market. So those are things to think about, that maybe we cannot just change with this one project, but definitely think we need to negotiate further.
Absolutely. And I mean, we should just acknowledge that part of the reason we were able to take on this long project and spend years is that we were both working in other areas and had support and funding through institutions, educational institutions, but also through our other jobs. And we just kind of, I mean, we weren't without support in that practice. So we should acknowledge that as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you'd like to say? Thanks, Linda.
No. I think I'm really curious if there are any questions.
Great. Well, we will be joining the participants of Yarnwire Institute in a different Zoom talk just a sec. So thank you all for tuning in, and take care. Be well. Keep your feet on the ground.